This is a video I'm making to enhance your understanding of a lot of the time that passes between Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 in terms specifically of the way that we talk about same-sex behaviors, gender issues, etc. So we've talked some about religious discourse in the past, and now we are talking about moving from religious discourse to the age of faith and beyond that to sexology. So first of all, you see that we're doing a little recapping here. Biblical discourse based on the notion that God in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or Allah in the Islamic tradition, that the Word of God is directly available in sacred texts like the Bible or the Quran. The big focus in the important parts that we looked at in the Old Testament was on identifying sins and punishments for them. As we learned a little bit more from our film, a lot of this was about establishing that one group was different from the groups surrounding them. In the case of the Old Testament, that meant a holiness code. And in the New Testament, customary behavior. And this is what distinguished early Christians, Hebrews, from believers and from their polytheistic religions surrounding them and same-sex worship. Of course, we've noted that much of what is said in the Old Testament is distorted by translation, and in the 20th century, a gigantic focus on literalist readings and interpretations. In any case, the language used by literalists that we focused on, the vocabulary, all the words that have the meanings that seem to be important through today, are words like deviant or disgusting, reparative therapy, indicating that anybody with same-sex behaviors or gender nonconformity is in need of repair. So not good, not in any state that we'd want. We'd have to repair it. Unnatural, there's always the use of that particular fallacy. Only that which is in nature is good. And of course, a lack of understanding in the ancient world of what natural really was in terms of the number of animals involved in same-sex behaviors. Ungodly, getting at that gender thing again, unmanly. The unfortunately chosen word abomination, unfortunately chosen by the King James Version of the Bible, those in King James Court who provided a version of the Bible in English, where we know that what we're really talking about is customary and non-customary. If we look at the original Greek, some of the Greek translations, but Hebrew texts, disorders, sins, and deserving of destruction, as in the interpretation, the traditional interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so this big period that passes in between that we don't really talk about much includes the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the time when the authority of the church in the West, that would mean the Catholic Church, until the time of the Protestant Reformation, was what set the ground rules in concert with kings who saw themselves as God's appointed rulers on earth. That's the case, too, until we get to more of the Protestant Reformation, and particularly in the case of our own American heritage with so much immigration from England. We have Henry VIII taking over his role as leader of the church in England and refusing the right of the Pope to be such a person in charge, and largely because he wants to be able to divorce and remarry multiple times to get a male heir, and perhaps for other reasons. And so thus begins the Anglican Church, or Church of England, which, as you might have remembered from the film, becomes in America much later the Episcopalian Church, still sometimes called the Anglican Church in the United States. So after these particular long ages of the church, particularly that means the Catholic Church dictating how things will be, we actually have a lot of things that happen that lead to the church losing its prestige. I'll get to those in a minute. And so you sort of move from what was the age of faith faith in God's representatives on earth to tell you how to think, act, be, to a real challenge to that in the Enlightenment age. And I'll just focus on one specific philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who used the Latin phrase that sapere aude, dare to be wise, or dare to know is how it translates, with his belief that we should very well be able to use our own God-given reason, okay, our faculties to think things through, to figure things out. And this is the kind of thinking that is behind much of the change from a very religious-based society to a very secular society. Some of the main figures are here in the picture of Bacon, Descartes, Rousseau, Jefferson. You can see that we get two people who had a lot to do with the foundation of the revolutions in the West, particularly in the United States and in France here, and that these were based on the notion that human beings could, through their own thinking abilities, discover what was reasonable and right, and then use that to govern themselves. So how did this all come about? So since the Age of Enlightenment, it was quite a bit earlier, but by the middle of the 18th century, so the mid-1750s and around that time, we have this going pretty strong. We have the writings of Locke, of Kant, of Bacon. These influence very much the thinking of those who are to go on to write their declarations of independence or to break away from the more religiously based society, or in the case of the United States, both the authority of the Church of England and the governing authority of England. So by the mid-19th century, this is fairly strong throughout the Western world. And it's arising because there's a lot going on that people are not happy about. The upper classes and the church are controlling land and money and access to any kind of knowledge. Of course, there's not much that you can do if you can't read, so there has been no education for most people that aren't in the upper class of the church. These are the people who are reading, writing, and know how to do those things and thus disseminate their ideas and have those ideas be taken as authoritative. There have been years of religious conflict by the time we get to the 18th century based on the conflicts between the Catholic Church and those who saw the various ways that it was abusing its authority, particularly things that bothered many were the selling of indulgences, which there's a whole thing you can look at what the Catholic Church views that as, but it had come to be there had come to be a practice of the Catholic Church selling redemption, salvation to people in order to raise money. And Martin Luther, the person who founded Lutheranism, this was one of his great complaints when he decided that he would challenge the Catholic Church, and the first huge breakaway from the Catholic Church, the movement of Lutheranism across the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany, Austria, the countries of Eastern Europe. So many years of religious wars. All right, that's one thing that had really caused dissent and disagreement over whose authority to talk about how things should be was the right authority. There was also the emergence of a new way of doing science. You probably have heard of it as, at least in our era, the scientific method. Coming up with ideas about how science and knowledge should be conducted. So coming up with an hypothesis, doing experiments, testing that, deducing from what your experiments what you could say is true and having evidence to support that. All right, so this was what science was doing, and then looking very much forward to finding new knowledge rather than just accepting the authority of what had been told and taught by those in power. Again, largely the church and the rising nation states, the clergy as the teachers, and the upper class as those in control of resources. So we have in this time a strong scientific drive to really categorize, or the word that is often used, taxonomize. Look at the world, divide it up into what we can understand as this is like this, and so this makes a class. This is like this, and so it makes a different class. So that's an important thing that's going on during this period of time before we get to the sexologist. So how did society really change? So many began to question the accepted truth that they had been given and the status of the rich and powerful. One big thing that happened in this period of time, well, earlier than the Enlightenment, but leading towards it in the 15th century, was the invention of the printing press and movable type. And suddenly you had Bibles that were written in the language of the peoples that were using them. The Gutenberg Bible in German is the first example of this, so that if people do actually begin to understand, begin to be able to read over many centuries now, we're talking, we don't get universal demands for people being in school until the 19th century. But those who can read it for themselves and not have it be about what the priest or the clergy is telling them. So this ultimately gives more power to the people over time. Makes intellectual thought not just the Bible, but any kinds of ideas being published now, although printed material is not really widespread, but it becomes more widespread. So things become open for discussion. Obviously, the ideas of those saying, dare to be wise, figure it out yourself, human reason can guide us, influences the American Revolution, rebellions against the powers that be, and the French Revolution, at about not too many years after the American Revolution, 1789 in France. There are things like coffee houses, debating societies, where people are going and talking about these ideas. And so we move away from the whole idea that man's whole purpose is to ignore his physical body and focus on his spiritual life, which is the tradition of Judeo-Christian thinking in the Bible, becomes much more about man should, and I'll just use man in the way they are, human beings, I should say, should be focusing on liberating themselves from superstitious ideas, being equal with each other, exercising the bonds of fraternity, brotherhood, I'll say sorority as well, but liberty, equality, and fraternity was the slogan of the French Revolution, and making decisions based on science and evidence rather than on religion and authority. Okay, so these influences still exist today. The idea that science and religion are separated, okay, that's pretty clear in the Western world, pretty clear in the anti-establishment clause of the American Bill of Rights in its Constitution. Certainly there are many then and many now who are comfortably within the traditions of both science and religion. There's even the Judeo-Christian Church's acceptance of scientific truths, while still maintaining that they have the right to comment on what is moral and ethical. And there is a pretty strong belief you would find throughout the Western world that reason, okay, as opposed to emotion or spirituality or something else of that kind, that's the key to understanding the world and its people. Some of these ideas would be characterized as, or under the term secularization, the social and cultural process by which non-religious beliefs and practices have really replaced religious beliefs and practices. A concomitant idea, something that goes along with this, is the notion of individualism, very strong in American ideology and history, that individuals should have freedom above responsibility to the community. Not that responsibility to the community isn't important, but that individuals' freedom itself is a goal and something that we want to pursue. Okay, so people began throughout this period to question the authority of the church and the existence of God and the role of Jesus. In Christianity, we have, for example, the notion of deists. This is the religion that was professed by many of the founding fathers in this country, And the idea was that God was a watchmaker. There was a God. He'd set something, he'd wound it up, he'd let it go, and now it was within our purview as human beings to decide what to do in our world. Others created a new kind of God and called it the goddess of reason, a very different idea for this to be a woman, but reason itself is the most important thing to pursue. And there's the belief that we can all attain to that. Others strengthen their faith in God, but also begin to question how it might be that religion could accommodate the notion that God is working through the laws of nature. Evolution could be a mechanism God used to achieve his or her gains, or in that way of thinking, continuing to find religion to be important. Okay? But it took time for these ideas to really spread and be popularized. And the main reason was, of course, that, as I mentioned earlier, many people really could not read. Others were very reluctant to think that they should risk their souls on these new and dangerous ideas. So the immediate influence was largely among the wealthy, educated classes. And that's who you see as the sexologists in the 19th century, the educated classes, with a trickle down by the late 19th century, and of course much more so in the early 20th century and throughout the 20th century when we get universal education in the United States and in other countries, that everybody should be in school, maybe originally till at least the 8th grade and then much longer. So then, 19th century, we have this background of questioning religion, authority of God, moving towards the authority of science. And so we have, as you've read about in Chapter 2, the rise of sexology and some of the key works that are just represented here in this slide. Psychopathia. There's an interesting word, isn't it? Psychopathy. But that's the Psychopathia Sexualis, the Latin or maybe Greek terms, I should say, there in the work of Richard von Krafft-Ebing. You have a very different emphasis with Havelock Ellis, but still studies in the psychology of sex. This is just one volume here on the slide, a whole volume devoted to the idea of sexual inversion. That's how important that idea was. Of course, the huge emphasis from Freud on sexuality, because Freud is the one saying, wow, we have sexuality as a drive from the beginning, and that can help us learn a lot about how human beings develop. If we grant that there is going to be a libidinous drive, and I'll just say that's a drive for pleasure. Now, we don't hear much about von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis today. We still hear about Freud. That's how important the field of psychoanalysis became and throughout the 20th century. And even when it was if we're no longer beholden to Freud for many things, you see the influence of Freud and his talk therapy method and many of his ideas in much that happens in the world of psychology and social work. Talk to me about it. What are your conflicts? Are these conflicts in any way related to the drives for pleasure, sexuality? Then I just threw in this cute little magazine cover to show you that Sexology was quite popular. This is from the 20th century, 1935. People wanted to know. This is what we want to focus on. This all grows out of an early desire to say, hey, we've got cities now. People are going to prostitutes. What about sexual health? What about the family? What about keeping people on the straight and narrow for the religious societies? What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? Well, we're going to study sex. And even though some may have been studying it for hygienic reasons, for social engineering reasons, others are studying just for knowledge reasons. But in any case, sexology is a move away from and a move to a very different discourse about sex. And the language of sexology, and sexology later becomes psychology, psychoanalysis, medicine, sociology, a lot of the things that we call the human sciences, the biological sciences. Still the language is the language of inversion. This is the kind of language you hear. This is not exactly the most positive language. Is it better than sin? Probably so. But you get inversion, you get deviance, abnormality, pathology, perversion. Third sex and earnings, that's maybe a more neutral kind of idea. You get the first time in history the use of the words homosexual and heterosexual. These are without the same meanings. We did not have these to indicate these identities until 1869, and heterosexuality even later. And it's gone through a variety of meanings, as the book points out. There was the notion of the criminally insane, mental illness, disease, disorder. If we're talking about Freud, he talked about arrested development, or sometimes that's referred to as a fixation or immaturity. We have Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing ultimately finding that they think that these things are congenital, that is, you're born this way, or they're innate, although Havelock Ellis has his ideas about other situations in which same-sex behaviors may arise. And you also have them, even von Krafft-Ebing later, basically finally moving away from the notion of illness whatsoever. But that doesn't get rid of the language and the way of talking about it. It's not really replaced until we move much further into the movements for rights. And as you can see from these ideas that are here on the screen, this particular discourse and language of sexology, many of these ideas continue to flourish and be believed today. Alongside, I might add, the religious ideas. The one last thing I wanted to draw your attention to really specifically in our chapter was the little piece you had about Michel Foucault, who is sometimes called the father of queer studies, or its patron saint, because he really focused on the idea that we had a major shift in the way that we thought about things in the 19th century, away from the notion that there were just acts that anybody can engage in, sodomy, for example, to all of the science, all of the psychology, calling on people to say what they were, so that we go from talking about what some behavior people might engage into an identity that people possess. And so that is what he means when he says a species, a kind of person. That has a good and a bad side. If you're a kind of person, then we start to study you relentlessly and try to pin down who you are. And that ends up creating all kinds of straitjackets for people. Now, Foucault also found, though, that there was a reverse side to this. Once you identify a group of people, they might use that very labeling, homosexual, for example, would have been the word, later gay, to say, oh, wait a minute, we'll use this and we'll define it in our own ways. We'll start adding to those definitions. This allows us to find others like us, and we will control some of the way that this gets talked about. And that is the big, large change and movement towards rights in the 20th century. Okay, I hope that this helps you and you can refer back to it. Just wanted to note that I have credited my sources here as coming from Google, images, and some slides, and their style adapted from DocStock.